Most people have heard of the Federal Reserve. You see the name in headlines, you hear it mentioned on financial channels, and you feel its influence every time interest rates move. But the real story of how the Federal Reserve began, how it was designed, who created it, and why so much of it happened in secret, is something most people have never been told. To understand why the Fed exists at all, you have to go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when the American financial system was anything but stable. Banking failures were common. Panic spread like wildfire, and there was no central authority coordinating the money supply. The country went through major financial collapses in 1873, 1893, and again in 1907. That last one nearly brought the entire banking system to its knees. During the panic of 1907, the U.S. government didn't step in to save the system. Instead, it turned to one man, J.P. Morgan. He wasn't an elected official, he wasn't part of the government, but he had the financial power and influence to organize rescue loans and stabilize the markets. For a short period, J.P. Morgan essentially acted as America's unofficial central bank. It was a wake-up call. The country needed a real institution that could step in during a crisis, not a single private banker. 3 years later, the real story begins. In November of 1910, a group of some of the most influential financial figures in the United States boarded a private train leaving New Jersey. They traveled under false names, told reporters they were going on a hunting trip, and avoided speaking openly with anyone who might recognize them. Their destination was a private resort on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. What they were about to do would shape the entire future of American finance. The men on that train included Senator Nelson Aldrich, Paul Warburg, Henry Davison from J.P. Morgan's firm, Frank Vanderlip from National City Bank, and Benjamin Strong, who would later become the head of the New York Federal Reserve. These weren't random guests. They represented enormous financial interests. For nearly a week behind closed doors, they worked on a plan to redesign the American banking system from the ground up. The reason for secrecy was simple. If the public learned that Wall Street bankers were privately drafting the structure of a central bank, the plan would have been rejected immediately. At the time, the country distrusted concentrated financial power, so the men kept the meeting confidential. They left the island with a proposal known as the Aldrich Plan, the foundation for what eventually became the Federal Reserve. When the plan was introduced publicly, it was met with intense criticism. Many Americans believed it would hand too much power to private bankers. Progressives argued it would place national financial control in the hands of elites. Because of this resistance, the Aldrich Plan failed. But the idea didn't disappear. Over the next few years, lawmakers modified it, added more public oversight, and changed its structure to make it appear more decentralized. On December 23, 1913, while many members of Congress had already gone home for the holidays, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law that same day. Without public fanfare, the Federal Reserve was officially created. The structure of the Fed was unique. It wasn't fully government and it wasn't fully private. It had a board of governors in Washington representing public authority, but it also had 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, which operated with private governance and influence from commercial banks. It was a hybrid system intentionally designed to balance political control with financial expertise. Over the decades that followed, the Federal Reserve gained more power, often during times of crisis. In the Great Depression, its actions and inactions reshaped its responsibilities. During World War II, it played a central role in financing the war. In 1971, when President Nixon ended the gold standard, the Fed gained even greater control over the money supply. In the 1970s, it battled runaway inflation with dramatically high interest rates, and in the crises of 2008 and 2020, the Federal Reserve stepped in with massive interventions, stabilizing markets by injecting trillions of dollars into the financial system. Because of its enormous influence, the Fed has always remained controversial. Some argue it has too much power, too much independence, and too little transparency. Others argue that without it, the American financial system would collapse under the weight of repeated crises. The truth lies somewhere in between. The Federal Reserve is a powerful institution created out of necessity, but shaped by politics, banking interests, and economic forces that most people never see. What makes its history so compelling is not just the secrecy of the Jekyll Island meeting, but the fact that this one event set the foundation for a system that influences mortgages, credit cards, stock markets, global trade, and everyday life. The Federal Reserve may feel distant or abstract, but the decisions made inside it ripple through the economy and directly affect millions of people. The creation of the Federal Reserve was not a conspiracy. It was a strategic act designed by influential figures who believed the country needed a modern financial system. But it was done quietly, away from the public eye, during a time when secrecy was seen as necessary to avoid political backlash. Over a century later, the impact of that decision is still felt today. Understanding how the Federal Reserve started isn't just a look into financial history. It's a reminder of how economic power often begins, grows, and concentrates behind closed doors, long before the rest of the world sees the results. That is the secret history of the Federal Reserve.